The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Offer my apologies. There was a misunderstanding on the time where this webinar was supposed to start, but we're going to go ahead and start it right now. It seems to be that there was a little problem with the time the webinar should be ending. But anyway, I'm glad that you guys are here. I can see some of you starting to join in. So let's give it a minute until everyone jumps in, and we'll start right away. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So let's start with the subject of the day. So this is a series of webinars that we're running every Tuesday, usually from 11:30 to 12. Today was wrongly scheduled from 11 to 11:30, so we'll try to compensate that. So we'll run 15 minutes later. So we're going to run until 11:45, if that's all right. It should take us about half an hour, and that should be enough for what we are going to show today. So if you have been following the previous webinar series, we have been doing a process where we're mimicking the typical things that you will do when you're exchanging files with your consultants and engineers, mainly crossing IFC files in and out. So we did a few webinars in the beginning where we're preparing our file to be able to set it up in a way that location was correct and LOD was correct, and having translators that were responsible for all of that. Now we're in the point where we already have shared most of the initial files, and we start to receive the files that have been sent by those engineers here. Let's go ahead. Again, just to get it out of the way, that's my name. I'm Nando Mogollon, and I'm a digital design consultant with Central Innovation. So today's objectives will be to cover the following points. So we're receiving the first set of files. These are going to be IFC files. Let's assume these will be from a structural engineer, and that structural engineer is using Revit, which might be the most common situation. So we're going to follow 3 steps. First one will be to quick audit the incoming file with the use of an IFC viewer. Then once we take a look at that file, and now that we know what we're going to get, we're going to fine tune a dedicated translator for that received file, and that will do inside ArchiCAD. And then we're going to see what effect will take whenever you receive a newer file, and then you have to make updates on the hotlink. Same thing, we'll show you fairly quickly what the effect on changes on the default tools will have on that particular update process on the hotlink. So first things first, you want to quick audit the IFC file. You want to do that on a neutral IFC viewer because a neutral IFC viewer will not require to do a translation. What that means is that IFC viewer, like the ones on the screen, on the left you have Solibri Anywhere, which is a viewer, but you also have Tekla BeamSight, BeamCollab Zoom, Beam Vision, the DDS CAD viewer, and that's just a handful sample of them. There are plenty more out there. These are the ones that I've tried that I know that work relatively well, and they give you a true view of the IFC for both the geometry and the parameters or the data. So all you want to do is to, without the need of any fancy features, you can use any of those viewers, which are typically free for download, use them to double check what's in the file. Now, the file that I will receive sort of looks like this. And let's say this is a quick screenshot or something that I saw when I was working with my engineer. Now, mind you, this is a made up file. It lacks a lot of detail, but it will do just enough for the kind of things that I want to show you. So that is the file as it is on Revit. we want to double check what that looks like when it's inside Solibri. So let's go and jump into Solibri. That's right there. And we'll go ahead and click on open a file. We'll look for, sorry, that's going to be this and this here. A share folder where I have the structural file as I've received it. Let's click on open that. And I'm going to classify that as a structural file. And voila, we've got that in front of you. Now, the couple of things that you want to check on an IFC viewer, other than just spinning around and looking around things, you see that what you have looks like the building you're working on. You want to look at the structure of the file to double check that you're not going to get any glitches inside ArchiCAD. One of them will be checking on the building stories. How to check that? If you go to this upper corner here, I'm using Solibri for this. It will be a similar thing if you use any of the other IFC viewers out there. You want to double check the site, then the building, and then a list of stories. That should match the list of stories you have in your ArchiCAD file. If, for whatever reason, you have extra stories in between, or above or below, it might be because the structural engineers may require what in Revit, in this particular case, is known as working planes. Now, they tend to build additional stories for that, but it's not completely necessary. One of the things that you can do to avoid that is to ask your engineer to untick the option to turn the working plane as a building story. So that's an option in Revit, and what that will do when transferred to IFC is that the story will still be there, the elements will still be there. They'll be associated to a working plane, but they will not be associated to an actual building story, since you have agreed on have a federated number of stories. So that's the first thing you want to check. Second thing you want to check is the composition of the file. So what type of elements are you getting through this file? And you can do so by either checking every single story. You can see there are slabs and walls, or you can use the second option up here where you can check the different type of elements that you have in here. Now we've got columns and beams, just a few beams in there. We have slabs and walls, like so, and we also have rebar. Now, these guys already started working on the rebar of this project, and that's the kind of thing that probably far too much detail for what I need. So that's the kind of stuff that you want to know prior to bringing the file to your own project, right? A couple of other things that I want to know, for instance, what is this column doing here, if that is a column, right? So that might be just a mistake, just simply someone placed something completely out of the place, and that'll be something you want to avoid. So you want to make note of these things so that you can avoid them when you're bringing in the file back to ArchiCAD. So one of the things that I'm going to note in here is that that particular element, if you look at the information or parameters about it, they'll have a few numbers and a few ways for you to identify that. I'm probably going to want to know the individual ID of that element, and that's this one down here called BATID, or Beam Application Tool ID, and that's the one that will identify that one element on its own. So I'm going to use that to identify that later on and avoid it in my file, since I know it's simply a mistake. Same thing for the rebar, although rebar, I know that it's coming as a type, so I can avoid it from the get-go. Cool, so that is what you're getting. Now let's jump back to our ArchiCAD file, and if you have seen these webinars, you're probably already familiar with this, so you know the shape of this file. So basically that's what it is, and it's pretty much a shell, right? Have basically an envelope there that has no real structure to it. So the one thing that I want to do is bring in that file so that I can keep working in collaboration with that one engineer. The first thing you want to do, just to follow our process, is to create a dedicated translator and fine-tune some of the items on that translator. So I'll show you this diagram here, and then we're going to go and jump back to ArchiCAD and we'll do it there. The critical things that you want to set up first, and those are these three. Those will be the model filter, so you can filter things in and out. So you saw that, on a quick audit of the file, I saw that there was rebar that I don't need, and comes with a bunch of polygons that will just make my file lose performance. Also want to check the layer, since that file comes with layers that are created by Revit or whatever the application was used to create the IFC. And you want to make sure that you know or can control how those layers will be converted back to ArchiCAD. And the third will be the materials and surface conversion. Why? You may be using that for the purpose of displaying your own file or your model, and you want to make sure that it looks, at least on a controlled way, so you don't get crazy colors or completely uncontrolled attributes for those things. Next thing you want to check is the type of elements that you're getting, basically saying, are columns coming in as columns, or are they coming in as objects or morphs or other elements. That'll be basically mapping IFC types, not Revit types, IFC types into ArchiCAD tools. That's what it actually does. Classification inside ArchiCAD will be a different thing, and that can be controlled with the type mapping, but this one will transfer or make the objects with a specific tool in ArchiCAD. And with the geometry conversion, you also affect the location of the file. So the IFC file, as we saw, I think it was webinar number 3, you saw that the location of the file was dictated by the location of the site, the building, and the stories. So with this, you can switch between the location of the general file, or the location of the site and the building. And lastly, you want to check, although you typically don't change much in this, check the types, the mapping of the types, and check the mapping of the properties. Properties, it might be useful, but it tends to be, not as common since the mapping of individual data on individual files tends to be done for the purpose of, code checking and other type of checking. But typically for this type of coordination, which tends to run mostly on geometrical stuff, doesn't really happen. So, but we're going to take a look at that later on in the year. So based on that, let's jump back to ArchiCAD. Let's go back to the floor plan. That's where we have our file sitting there. And what you want to do is go to your OpenB menu, IFC Translators. And from here, what we want to do is to start building up a dedicated translator for it. Now, your file should have these out-of-the-box translators that are pre-built in the template. Start with one that gets closer to the kind of file that you're receiving. For instance, I'm receiving a file that I know was put together with Revit, so I probably start with the Revit structure import, and then create a new one that is a duplication of that. Now, because of the purpose of this one translator, meaning it is going to be a dedicated translator, I'm just going to type in the number of the project, which I made up, calling it 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll say this is going to be for the structural model. So I have that. The next thing that I'll do is I want to create some dedicated presets for the things that I mentioned just earlier. For instance, the first one will be for the model filter. So I'm going to go ahead, create a new one, and I'll call it pretty much the same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, structural filter. Hold on, already exists. Let's call it structural model. Might be from one of the previous tries that I gave it to this. So I have that. And what you want to bring or filter is, I want to make sure that I can filter in at the moment of linking in. That's why you want to leave that box ticked on. That's going to give me the opportunity to go and search for that one misplaced column. After that, pretty much everything is fine, except for the fact that I don't want to have this IFC reinforcing element. That's the one that's going to bring in the rebar, and I don't need that. Or I've decided that for the purpose of this one exercise, don't need that. Just going to create extra complexity in the model that I don't need, and I want to avoid it. So I'm just going to unclick that, and just by doing that, that piece of the model won't even be considered in the time at the time of the import. So that's fine. So let's click on OK. Let's make sure that we're using that one. There you go. Now let's manipulate the layers. So I'll do the same. Let's create one that says 1, 2, 3, 4, structural model. And then this one will be fed up with the information in that IFC file. The way you do that is simply by saying, look, I want to bring in the files, but I want to make sure that they are populated with an extension called IFC str. And I don't want to do a mapping, but I actually want to make sure that they created with this particular extension. So I'm not going to use the existing mapping. Create an additional layer for the openings because they tend to be solids. So to create these solid element operations in some cases. So let's leave that like so. That'll be fine. The materials will be a similar thing. And this particular case, I want to create a new one. Same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, str model. Because I'm using this out-of-the-box translator, I can see that some of these materials are being pre-populated with a matching material in ArchiCAD. But what you actually want to do is, because you don't know how that file was put together, is to actually bring in prior to the conversion, you actually want to bring in the materials that were or that exist in that particular structural file. And you can do so simply by pointing at the IFC, click on opening. This will read the IFC, and it will read those elements as they were in the original file. So what you actually want to do is map that into something that makes sense in your file. Could be that concrete can go to concrete, cast in situ, you just make that another same thing. Default floor, nobody really knows what that is, so I'm just gonna make that something like timber, or it could be a generic type of material. You can change that in any times, so that's why you want to build a dedicated translator. Let's use this concrete structural for that. Metal deck, no needed, just plain steel. Same thing for this. Let's go for iron. And this could be, again, concrete structural. Say that. So basically what you're doing is, by doing so, you will be avoiding the creation of additional attributes in your file and rather mapping it into something that already exists in your file and that you can control. So if I'm happy with that, just go ahead, click on OK. Let's make sure that we're using those like so. So now I've created these critical ones. Let's go ahead and check the geometry conversion for the same reason. Want to make sure that got dedicated one with the actual name that I'm using. Click on OK there. Now, for this, there are a couple of things that you need to know. What this is going to change is the ability of ArchiCAD of converting IFC types into specific or built with specific ArchiCAD tools. You only have a few options, and the options have a default when ArchiCAD cannot build it in that particular way. So this default way will try to build columns as columns, but if it can't, because maybe the column has a shape that ArchiCAD cannot build with a column tool, maybe it is very typical and common that slabs in Revit can have a slope on the top, so they can have, sloping in and out or different points for drainage and so on. And that little slope cannot be built with the ArchiCAD slab tool. So it needs to either build that element as an object or as a morph, because there's no other way to build it. Otherwise, it will force everything to be morph or force everything to be more objects. Morphs tend to be great when you're trying to control the 2D representation, and they don't add any additional libraries. They just built in elements inside the file. Objects on the other side, but hold on, but morphs can affect the performance of the file since they're raw geometry. Objects on the other side, they're compressed, they are nicely put together in a library, so that adds a little bit more work on you managing that particular library. If you're working on a teamwork file, you probably have to upload that to Beam Cloud. If you're working locally, you need to make sure that it's placed on a location that everyone can see, or alternatively, saving that as the embedded library. But if you do so, you'll have the issue of increasing file size. But they do not affect performance. Performance is pretty good when it comes to objects. So you choose which one you want to use. Typically for a structural file, you probably want to use construction elements, otherwise objects, and that still be fine. Otherwise, other elements will turn to be objects, and then you see that you only have these two options. That's for elements that might not be recognizable for ArchiCAD or ArchiCAD tools. For instance, those rebars. If we were going to bring that in, we only have two options to turn them into either morphs or objects. And the geometry of the site, which I know there's nothing, but just to make sure, let's ensure we don't bring anything. And the location of the file, which is a topic that we cover extensively in the first 3 or 4 webinars. So leave that as for the site. Tends to work pretty well, but if it fails, it might be that the Revit company didn't get right what was supposed to be the location of the file, but for that we already shared a reference location file with the grid lines and everything. Now let's leave that as it is, so that'll be fine. Let's make sure we're using that preset. Type mapping and property mapping, again, don't want to change any of that right now because I don't have any particular requisites in there, so don't need to change any of that. That's going to modify the IFC types into classifications inside ArchiCAD, and or the IFC properties being mapped into either an ArchiCAD property or IFC properties. But again, not going to change any of that now. That'll suffice for what we want to do today. So I've created a dedicated translator. I'll click on OK. And now the only thing I want to do is to bring in that file to this file in here. Now, when probably you were not aware of this, but when we initially exported this file, we have decided that this particular corner here was going to be our new 0. And the reason why that is because we have been using a geolocated reference point, and now geolocated reference point is actually that point right there. When we bring in the file, we'll see if that file needs to be relocated or not. So now that I have a translator for that, all I need to do is to go to external content, place a hotlink, make sure you use proper layer for that. So it could be that IFC structural layer. Select a module for it, which I don't have at the moment. Let's go ahead and bring that in. That'll be this one here. And it's going to be this file. But watch out which translator this is using. This is using one for general import, which is not the one I put together just now. So you actually want to go to options and make sure that it's choosing not any of the templates, but rather your current project, since that's where I built it in. And choose the 1, 2, 3, 4 structural model translator, just dedicated one. Choose that, select that. It's going to be the file, and place the hotlink. This window here is the little tick box that I showed you in the very beginning. And what this is doing is essentially saying, look, this is what I found in the file. Tell me if you want to bring in all of that. Now, from the get-go, I know I don't want to bring the rebar at all, so I'll untick that. And I know that there's a column. See if you remember that. There's a column up here that I know it's a mistake, so I don't need to bring that in. The way for me to identify that will be that little number here, and probably the type. Type is a good way for you to at least find the group where that column might be found. So 165 by 5.4. So let's go back here. And if you go and check columns, you'll find that in here they say what are they built like, and they also give you a long list of all the different types: universal columns, concrete rectangular, and then I have that one on the very first on the list. That's a one, and then if you see that last number there, that's actually the same number you have here. So I know that I can simply avoid that since that is a mistake. So everything else should be fine. Bringing in walls, columns, slabs, and walls, that's all right. I'm not bringing any rebar, and I have avoided that particular column. That will do. There are many other ways to filter that in, by story or layers if you like, but that will suffice. I'm just clicking OK. This is going to try to match the level, so make sure if you're using ground floor, match a ground floor to the ground floor. So everything else will match nicely. Make sure it's pasted to the original location. And my file's being placed down here. Now the reason why that is there is because this file, it's using that original point, which is the base point in Revit. Now, because I've done this already, I know that all that needs to be done in here is that that file needs to be placed up here. So there are several things you can do with it. You can simply just click outside, and then we'll carry on and move the file if it comes in the wrong place, like so. And all I need to do in that case, and this is because I already know and I have control over that, is simply move that model from this point to my reference point. Now you can get really close if you want to make sure that it's getting it right. And that'll be aligning those two files. So now if you go and take a look, this, which is the structural incoming file, you can tell by the layers, that'll be the file that I was asking for, and the file that you saw previously. If we double check what's the content of the file, we'll see that in. I think I've got an override for that, sorry, there you go. But now you can see that, the file is pretty much the same, and I'm avoiding that little column that was floating up there. Pretty much everything else as it is. Now, let's go and double check a couple of things that we have in here. So what happens, so we have already built that translator with this dedicated translator where you link that in. But there are a couple of things that happens when you hotlink and you update the file. One is that for every single element that you bring in, you want to keep a favorite so that you can control the two-dimensional representation of that file. Let me show you the effect on that. For instance, all the columns that are brought in are represented like this column here. So that column, you see, that's part of the hotlink. If it happens that, you see that is not quite the building material that you were expecting to get, then maybe what you, or the representation in plan view that you're expecting to get, and rather you say, look, I want all the structural columns that are coming in to be green, right? And I don't want them to have that little cross hair there. I want them to be just plain green blocks. That's what I want it to be. You can build a graphic override for that, not a problem. Let me make sure that we're not running any overrides. But there's a different way in which you can control that based simply on the default that you're running for all of your elements. For instance, columns, if I place a single column, let me place one right here on the side. That's my, say, architectural column. If I want to override all of those by default without having to create an override, but simply by every single column in that particular hotlink, all you need to do is to change the defaults of the column tool. So for instance, I don't want to have a crosshair, so I'm changing that. I don't want to have colors as they're coming in, but rather have them in green. So let's actually pick up something more concrete, like say something like that. Kind of like that. So if I want all my columns to look like that, all I need to do is to make sure that that is my default. So you can use your eyedropper to that. So if I place a new column, they're going to look exactly like that. Or even better, save an individual favorite for that particular type of element, so that the next time you don't need to remember it and don't need to do it manually. Now, only because I've done that, I can go, actually, let's do it through here. I can go ahead and do a right click and update that hotlink. And you'll see that all the columns that are coming in, let's avoid the rebar and avoid that first column. All these columns will now change in representation to match whatever defaults you have. So you can still use graphical overrides for individual purposes, but this might be a good way for you to control, the overall representation of those type of elements. For instance, those columns right there. So now that you have changed that, you can control the same thing for slabs and beams and any other type of elements. It might be the case that sometimes you want to avoid particular elements. Now, for instance, some elements might be wrong and you say, look, they've got it all right, but they didn't get this column right. And I just noticed that. Is there a way for you to hide only that? Well, if you hide the column, if you have the layers, all of them will be hidden, so not quite a right thing to do. But now you know that only or simply by checking that little number on the file, you will be able to identify individual elements and just unclick them during the update. So for instance, if I want to hide or ignore this column altogether, all you need to do is to go into this, double check this number, 562, and then avoid that one. Once again, all you need to do is update that hotlink. It'll give you that list in here. And I know that's a concrete column. So the only thing that I need to look for is, I believe is 562. 562. So it's going to be, these are split lines. So let's get rid of these ones here. I'm going to get rid of a bunch of them in different stories. So probably just, actually, I think I know how to do that. Let's get that on. Then we go to the stories. That's going to be on the ground floor. .562 actually is this one here. So let's get rid of that. Click on OK. And after the update, that column should not be there anymore. There you go. It's gone, and you can replace it with your own column with the right location. Good. Now that we're done with that, let's wrap it up. So you can control to the information on that. And that's it for today. So next week, we're going to cover some of the questions you guys have asked, and we're going to keep going through the process of hot linking and exchanging files with other element types and doing a second loop of the exchange. Remember, you can get your help from Central Innovation, from the support emails for both Australia and New Zealand. You can get any help that you need through your customer success email or calling the hotline, both Australia and New Zealand. Thank you very much for your time, guys, and we'll see you next Tuesday. I'll make sure that we can clarify the time next time. Thank you very much, and have a good day.